Few days ago, Türkiye had just held a highly contested presidential election. While culminating in a victory, this election proved to be longtime President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's greatest challenge. The elections were held against the backdrop of a worsening economy and high inflation. The opposition had largely come together, hoping to wrest power from President Erdoğan's Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi, or the Justice and Development Party, AKP. In the eyes of many, the country has increasingly gotten polarized, with the population being divided along political lines. However, this is not the first time Turkey has witnessed such political polarization. The last time Turks fought so passionately over politics, the country was on the verge of falling into total anarchy. To tell the story of Turkey's forgotten civil war, let's go back to the year 1960.
Sevgili vatandaşlar, dün gece yarısından itibaren bütün Türkiye'de deniz, hava, kara Türk Silahlı Kuvvetleri el ele vererek memleketin idaresini ele almıştır. Bu hareket silahlı kuvvetlerimizin müşterek işbirliği sayesinde kansız başarılmıştır. Sevgili vatandaşlarımızın sükûn içinde bulunmalarını ve resmi sıfatı ne olursa olsun hiç kimsenin sokağa çıkmamalarını rica ederiz.
It was the 27th of May 1960. The Turkish nation had just woken up to the radio address of Colonel Alparslan Türkeş. It was announced that the Turkish armed forces had seized control of the government, overthrowing the previous government of Adnan Menderes. The new military leader, General Cemal Gürsel, quickly got around to working towards restoring democracy. However, a powerful group of 14 military officers, under the leadership of Colonel Türkeş, seek to establish an authoritarian government instead. Considering the group to be too radical, General Gürsel exiled them abroad. Overcoming that obstacle, the government promulgated a new constitution and held new elections to the parliament, steps towards finally restoring civilian rule. The results led to the formation of a coalition government with former President İsmet İnönü as the new prime minister. This was the start of a new chapter in the republic's history, with its leaders seeming to be working towards realizing the dream of a democratic Kemalist state. However, it was not as rosy as it looked. The 1961 constitution emphasized far more on democracy and political plurality than the constitutions before and after it. With the parliament being made up of more parties, the political landscape became diverse in comparison to before. In the decades prior, the country's discourse was completely dominated by Kemalism, with disputes being largely regarding economic policies. Therefore, neither the far left nor the far right could previously gather much support for their causes. But the situation would completely change in the 1960s. Although the previous government was ousted in 1960, its supporters reorganized around the right-wing Adalet Partisi, or AP, whose leader was Süleyman Demirel. Like its previous incarnations, the Democrat Party of Adnan Menderes, it was overwhelmingly backed by the conservative countryside. This led to the AP getting elected to power in both 1965 and 1969, with Demirel becoming prime minister. The new right-wing government strived to build a more market-based capitalist economy, in contrast to the statist economy pursued by the Kemalists under İsmet İnönü. This encountered reactions from the left and the right. From the early days of the Turkish Republic, the communists found themselves on the sidelines of politics, as the previous one-party Kemalist state had long suppressed the movement. Although Marxists considered Kemalism to be liberal bourgeois in nature, they considered it to be a better alternative to the right-wing Islamists. In the years after World War II and the rise of Adnan Menderes, Turkey grew closer to the United States. joining NATO in 1952. This was occurring as the Cold War was raging on between the US and the USSR. With Turkey firmly in the Western camp, the government became far more repressive of communists domestically. However, it was the 1960 military coup that opened the fortunes of the movement in the country. With the promulgation of a new constitution, the political landscape opened up for socialists and other leftists. In 1965, the Türkiye İşçi Partisi, or TİP, became the first socialist movement to be represented in the parliament, winning 3% of the vote and 15 seats in the elections. In an attempt to win the elections, the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi also moved towards the left, an initiative taken under a young politician named Bülent Ecevit. This reflected the growing popularity of socialism among the youth, especially university students and intellectuals during the period. In response to the rise of the far left, the far right also rose to prominence in the 1960s. Unlike in many European democracies, the Turkish far right was divided into two major camps, the Islamists and the ultranationalists. Ever since the Ottoman sultans first emerged as the new caliphs of Islam in 1517, their empire became the center of the Muslim world. Islam was a key component of the identity of the Turkish people. Although the Kemalist state in the early to mid-1900s strived to create a Turkish identity detached from pan-Islamism, the countryside remained religious. This fact clearly emerged in the 1950 elections, when the more conservative and religion-friendly Demokrat Partisi emerged victorious and formed a government. This trend further continued in the 1960s, and more and more Turks were migrating from the countryside to the cities. Politically, many Islamists organized themselves around the Milli Görüş movement of Necmettin Erbakan. As an Islamist, Erbakan was opposed to Turkish secularism and the political status quo. This then led to frequent clashes between him and the Kemalist dispensation. However, Erbakan was also opposed to Demirel's government, deeming it to be in collusion with quote-unquote Freemasons and Zionists. Nevertheless, he was not the only extremist on the far right of Turkish politics. While the Islamist right was experiencing a reawakening, the ultranationalists also rose steadily to prominence in the 1960s. Ever since the formation of the Republic in 1923, Atatürk and the Kemalist ruling elite seek to instill a sense of nationalism among the new country's inhabitants that tied them to Anatolia and East Thrace. This was an attempt to suppress any notions of pan-Turkism, an irredentist ideology which seek to reunite all Turkic ethnic groups under a single entity. In the 1940s, and as Nazi Germany invaded the USSR, pan-Turkists began to increasingly advocate for involvement in the war, contrary to the İnönü government's policy of neutrality. This then led to the racism-Turanism trials in 1944 and 1945, where the accused were charged of spreading racist and pan-Turkist ideas and of attempting a coup d'etat. Instead of suppressing the movement, the trials brought the aforementioned Alparslan Türkeş to the limelight. After returning back to Turkey in 1963, Türkeş entered politics, becoming a member of the far-right Cumhuriyetçi Köylü Millet Partisi. After becoming the leader of the party, he formulated the Dokuz Işık doctrine, giving the party a more pan-Turkist character. Then, in 1969, Türkeş rebranded the party, forming the Milliyetçi Hareket Partisi, or MHP. The party advocated for a synthesis between Islam and Turkic nationalism. Alparslan Türkeş, called Başbuğ or leader by his followers, also oversaw the founding of the far-right paramilitary movement called the Bozkurtlar. Harboring close ties to the MHP, the movement was named after the Grey Wolf, a major figure in old Turkic mythology. Türkeş and the organizations he founded were fervently anti-communist, with both sides of the political spectrum becoming increasingly radicalized. Things could only go worse. 1968. In a single year, Europe was rocked by protests, demonstrations, and revolutions. In France, left-wing protesters almost overthrew President Charles de Gaulle, while Italy witnessed the start of a brutal 2-decade-long civil war. In Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union repressed an attempt at reform. Therefore, how could Turkey avoid this year of unrest? In July 1968, left-wing student demonstrations broke out as the Sixth Fleet of the United States Navy paid a visit to Istanbul. Then, in 1969, the US ambassador's car was vandalized by socialist students. In response, the right also began to take up arms, with the ultranationalist Komandolar, affiliated with the Bozkurtlar, beginning to attack left-wing students. Amid a worsening economy, political violence continued to flare up into the next decade, with Prime Minister Demirel and his government being unable to contain the chaos. And then the Turkish military stepped in. On the 12th of March 1971, Turkish armed forces handed a memorandum to the Prime Minister, effectively amounting to an ultimatum. Demirel then resigned and restrained his party from protesting the move. Although initially it seemed to be a move taken by the radical sections of the army, it later became clear that this was an initiative of the conservative top brass of the military. The generals hesitated from seizing power directly and instead called for the formation of a government led by Dr. Nihat Erim. The new government tried to crush the burgeoning political extremism in the country, primarily the one on the left. Both Demirel and İnönü accepted the new dispensation and were willing to cooperate with it. However, Ecevit and his left-wing supporters in the CHP were opposed to the military-backed governments of Dr. Erim and his successor, Ferit Melen. However, despite the military's intervention in 1971, political violence remained uncontrollable for most of the decade. The 1970s in Turkey were defined by political violence. The communist armed groups on the left and the Bozkurtlar on the right turned the streets of Turkey into a massive meat grinder. Assassinations, kidnappings and massacres were the new norm. Fueling the seemingly endless war between the two factions were the country's youth, university graduates who had lost hope in the status quo amidst the deteriorating economic and political situation. They turned to the charismatic rhetoric of İbrahim Kaypakya on the left and of Alparslan Türkeş on the right. Now you had young and zealous men on both sides willing to kill or be killed for their cause. Two of the main divides which seeped into the struggle between the left and the right were ethnicity and religion. Many in Turkey's ethnic and religious minorities, such as the Kurds and the Alevis, backed the far left. Therefore, they earned the ire of the far right. This led to the 1978 Maraş massacre, which claimed the lives of around 100. The Turkish state at the time could be said to have been reluctant to act against the Bozkurtlar, and the main reason for that reluctance was related to the country's fractured political system. In the 1973 elections, there was no clear winner. The CHP, the largest party in parliament, then formed a coalition with Necmettin Erbakan's Milli Selamet Partisi, or MSP, the second iteration of his Milli Görüş movement. This was perhaps a match made in hell, as CHP's new leader, Bülent Ecevit, was the guardian of Atatürk's legacy, while Erbakan was the complete antithesis to that vision. Nevertheless, the coalition lasted for a few months, successfully overseeing the Cyprus crisis of 1974, which increased Ecevit's popularity among the masses. However, Demirel united the right by forming the Milliyetçi Cebhe, or the Nationalist Front, and became the Prime Minister. Included in this coalition were Erbakan's MSP and Turkish's MHP. To remain in power, Demirel was forced to give them high-ranking positions in the government. With the government and the security apparatus filled with those sympathetic to the Bozkurtlar, they became unable to act against them. The coalition limped along till the 1977 elections. Although the CHP once again emerged as the single largest party in parliament, Demirel's allies forced Ecevit out of power and formed the second Milliyetçi Cebhe. However, the government collapsed and Ecevit returned to power in 1978, but his tenure would be marred with the rising political violence in the country and his inability to control it, despite him declaring martial law in 13 provinces. Then, in 1979, Demirel again rose to power and became Prime Minister. By this time, the country was on the verge of total collapse. The economy was deteriorating while inflation was skyrocketing to new peaks. Political stability was nowhere in sight, neither in the parliament nor on the streets. Many wondered if the military would intervene to save the republic once again. The decision now squarely laid on the Turkish armed forces and their chief, General Kenan Evren, with General Evren follow the precedent set by his predecessors and stage a coup to protect the legacy of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk.
Aziz yurttaşlarım, bir defa daha belirtiyorum ki, silahlı kuvvetler, aziz Türk milletinin hakkı olan refah ve mutluluğu, vatan ve milletin bütünlüğü ve gittikçe etkisi azaltılmaya çalışılan Atatürk ilkelerine yeniden güç ve işlevlik kazandırmak, kendi kendini kontrol edemeyen demokrasiyi sağlam temeller üzerine oturtmak, kaybolan devlet otoritesini yeniden tesis etmek için yönetime el koymak zorunda kalmıştır. Komutan, subay, assubay ve erler olarak hepimiz vatan ve milletin refah ve mutluluğu uğruna her şeyimizi, bu arada hayatımızı dahi seve seve feda etmeye hazırız. Memlekette her zaman bulunabilen ve özellikle son zamanlarda çoğalan kötü niyetli birçok kişi ve kuruluşlar sizlere yalanlar düzerek bunun aksini söyleyebilecekler ve menfi propagandalara başvurabileceklerdir.
It was the 12th of September 1980. The Turkish armed forces under the command of General Kenan Evren had just overthrown the government of Süleyman Demirel and formed a military junta. The new military junta had one aim in mind: bring an end to the chaos of the 1970s. For them, the root cause of the chaos were the politicians of that era. Therefore, Evren suspended the parliament and municipal councils, dissolved all political parties, and arrested major political leaders. Universities were brought under state oversight, with left-leaning professors being dismissed from their jobs. Media was restricted as the government ordered the closure of many newspapers. A state of emergency was declared in the country, with all power now being vested in the military. The new governing body of Turkey was the Milli Güvenlik Kurulu, or MGK, or the National Security Council, headed by General Kenan Evren. Although the junta eventually released many of the major political leaders of the past, they were forbidden from returning to politics. To combat political violence, General Evren launched a wave of arrests targeted at those involved in stoking tensions between the left and the right. This led to a drastic reduction in politically motivated violence. However, this success was achieved at a huge social and human cost. General Evren's junta had kept tens of thousands of people in jails, with many facing torture at the hands of security forces. This junta also was accused of using this campaign to arrest anyone remotely associated with communism. Then in 1982, a new constitution was approved in a referendum with 91.4% of the vote. This constitution was to be significantly less liberal than the 1961 constitution in an attempt to correct the political liberalization of the 1980s, which had led to the violence of the 1970s. With the adoption of a new constitution, General Kenan Evren's program of reversing the consequences of the 1960 coup d'etat had come to an end. Türkiye would never be the same again. Thank you for watching the video. If you wish to watch something related to Turkey, you can click on the video on the left, which is about the Turkish War of Independence. But if you wish to watch something else, you can click on the video on the right, which is about the Albanian Civil War of 1997.